Hey everybody, and welcome back for the third video from Chapter 2. Today we're going to be shifting from broad concepts to a more applied critical thinking topic, in this case, measuring the money supply. So as an overview, we're first going to be talking about monetary aggregates, what they are, and how we measure them, and then we're going to contrast the differences in the two definitions that the US government uses. So what even is a monetary aggregate? A monetary aggregate is just a measure of the quantity that is broader than currency, so your physical bills. And in this case, in the US, we use M1 and M2 as our monetary aggregate measurements. So first with M1. The M1 aggregate is the more narrow definition of money supply that the Fed uses. All that it is just the sum of physical currency in circulation and the amount of money in checking account deposits. So if you look at the graph at the bottom of the page, it shows the M1 aggregate from 2000 to present. As you can see, it's slowly increasing, and this is for a multitude of reasons. First, incomes are just generally going up in the US, and then also inflation, while low, was positive over the entire duration. This is true up until March of 2020, when you guessed it, COVID hit. Immediately after COVID, you can see this huge spike in the M1 aggregate. And that comes from two things. First, people just aren't spending as much. So they have more money in their checking accounts. This is because they were more fearful of what the future may hold and they're not going on vacations or anything else. Additionally, as we discussed in the last video, the Fed injected a massive amount of cash into the US economy. And this was in form of almost strictly M1 aggregate money. So this massive singular spike in about July coincides with the passage of the CARES Act. And so you can see that this is first off completely unprecedented in terms of historical magnitude of monetary response, even when we compare it to the 2007 financial crisis over here. Now, this contrasts with the M2 aggregate, which is a broader definition of what money supply is. The M2 aggregate has all M1 assets in it, plus time deposits with less than $100 of value. So this includes, like CDs or small bonds. And then it also includes the money in savings accounts, which, if you don't know, differentiates from checking accounts because from a checking account you can withdraw directly for checks or debit cards, while with savings accounts you can't. And then it finally includes non-institutional money in mutual fund shares that we talked about in the very first video. And as you can see for the graph below, the fact that the Fed had on the M2 money aggregate is actually a lot less in the grand scheme of things compared to the M1 aggregate. This is because, as I mentioned, the Fed almost injected strictly M1 currency into the economy, and so this spike is just really the M1 change. However, when you look at the massive size of the M2 aggregate, it doesn't have nearly as big of share. And when we compare M1 and M2, you can see why. So on the left, we have, as of July 2020, the composition of M1 aggregate. On, as you can see, checking accounts had about 66 or two-thirds of the total M1 aggregate, while currency had just one-third. So we're really seeing this decline in physical currency and its usefulness. But when we look at the M2 aggregate, you can see M1 is not insignificant, but is also not comparable to M2. And the reason for that is a bulk of financial assets in the United States held by households are in savings deposits. Savings deposits make up about two-thirds of the M2 aggregate. Small time deposits and money market mutual fund shares both have about like combined 10%, so not insignificant. But savings deposits have a huge bulk of American wealth, and that really wasn't affected too much by COVID and the Fed's response. So what should we use? What should we look at? And why do they even matter, the differences? Well, when we look at M2, historically speaking, as you can see in panel A, the demand for M2 increases a lot more rapidly in the 20th century compared to M1. And the reason for that is because households don't want as liquid assets as they maybe did before. They, may be more trusting of the financial system. They may have more disposable income to begin with, so they're not worried about the liquidity that they have available. Also, with the technological advancements that we talked about in the last video, it's just quicker and easier to access your money, so you don't need the speed that you have with M1 money. So M2 is already growing a lot quicker. However, when we talk about forecasting, the usefulness of M2 compared to M1 is still a very open question. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next video, in particular with a discussion on inflation.